Hi, welcome to the second episode of NUJS Society of International Law and Policies podcast. Today, I am Akshat Goyal. I'm the convener of the society for the present year. Along with me, I have Rudra Athray, who is the team head for podcasts. And today, we have a very special guest who has flown all the way from Jindal. We have Professor Chhaya Bharadwaj with us. Rudra, if you may.
Yeah, thanks, Akshat. Hello, I'm Rudra Athray, and I'll just take a few minutes to introduce our guest today. Ms. Chhaya Bharadwaj is currently an associate professor at the Jindal Global Law School and a United Nations trained international lawyer. She has completed her BA LLB from Lloyd Law College in 2015. Thereafter, she was selected as an international scholar at Environmental Law Center at the Vermont Law School to pursue her LLM in international environmental laws. After completing her LLM, she joined Lloyd Law College as an assistant professor, where she started the Environmental Law Center and served as its assistant director. She also started the International Migration and Refugee Law Center at Lloyd. In 2018, she assisted Mr. Dayat Lade at United Nations International Law Commission with his work on preemptory norms of general international law, juscosions. She has received various accolades like the United Nations Fellowship in 2017 to attend the regional course in international law for Asia Pacific. In 2018, she was awarded with the Local Pathways Fellowship by United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network for her work in environmental education and youth employment. In 2019, she was awarded with Junior Scholars Scholarship by Asian Society of International Law to attend the 7th ASIL Biennial Conference on International Law. She has received Best Research Paper awards from institutions like the Law Commission of India for her research in environmental and international law. Apart from public international law, her interest areas are environmental law and information laws, international development, and international dispute settlement mechanisms. Chaya, welcome to the podcast, and we're
Thank you.
thankful for you being here.
Thank you so much. That was a very detailed introduction, Rudra.
Yes. So, Chaya, to just get things started, we're just reading up on you for this podcast, and we realized that you've done a lot of work in refugee laws as well as environmental laws. So, could you just explain to us how did you decide upon these two areas of law? And as a secondary question, do you think that these two areas of law, refugee laws and environmental laws, do they interface with one another, especially in this time?
So there are two parts to this question, Rudra. The first part is how did I get interested in this particular area, or how did I become aware of this particular area? I think when I was doing my master's in environmental law from Vermont Law School, that was the first time I came across the term climate refugees or climate change refugees. And so that was the point where I started becoming interested at the intersection of migration laws and environmental law or climate change laws generally. And I realized that at the international level, there's a lack of a legal framework governing this particular sector. And even in India, if we look at domestically, there's no legal framework that will govern this particular framework that is currently governing this particular framework. And I was lucky to be working with professionals and experts at Jindal Global University and at international organizations like International Organization of Migration, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and the International Law Commission. I worked with experts who were working at this particular intersection, which is climate change and migration laws.
Exactly.
So that exposed me to the nuances of this particular intersection, and that's how I started working on it. Now, the second part of your question is what is the relation between refugee laws and environmental laws? So, if I'm broadly talking about the context to say migration laws, within migration law, refugee law is a part of migration law, and then there are other factions of migration law as well, which is internal migration, and then cross-border migration, forced migration, voluntary migration, so on and so forth. And refugee law is only one faction of the broader migration law faction. How is refugee or environmental law connected? is through the term climate change refugees. Now, climate change refugees, I don't know if you've heard this term before, but is a term that is used often, and there's no legal foundation, there's no legal basis to use this term right now. So, if you were to ask real-time experts in refugee law and migration law, they will tell you that climate refugee or climate change refugee is not a legal term. It's more of a political term that is used to politicize the issue of climate change and environmental related migration. Currently, if you're aware, Pakistan is going through massive flooding and inundation due to sea level rise and the melting of glaciers, and 1/3 of Pakistan is inundated. And due to this inundation, due to this flooding, approximately 35 million people are forced to leave their homes. Now, these 35 million people could be migrating internally or across borders. And if they ended up migrating across borders, moved to another country, currently there's no framework that will allow them to seek protection because of the forceful factors due to which they are forced to leave their homes. And there are very less chances that the country to which they've migrated will have a domestic framework to protect them. I can think of a couple countries like Sweden or Australia that have some provisions in their migration laws which allow access to protection if a person is forced to leave its country of origin because of environmental factors like flooding, sea level rise, earthquake, volcano, so on and so forth. But this is not a law that countries want to have in their domestic legislations, and definitely not as a treaty or as a legally binding framework under international law. So that is broadly about refugee and environmental law.
Just to jump in there, as you pointed out, that there exists no such legal framework and they are still not recognized legally. Collating that with your work with the UNSDS network, was there any factions of the UN, or rather, are there such international organizations out there, or any NGOs that are out there that are working for this particular cause? Or if there is any legal development or any international law related development, is the ILC reports or anything of that sort that's working towards giving them recognition, giving them the support that they need?
Yes, so International Law Commission is currently working on, they have a study group that is focused on sea level rise and international law. Within that, they have three different legal sections that they're working on: delimitation, statehood, and protection of people and human rights. I assisted Professor Dr. Nilofer Oral, who's the chair of this particular study group, and I majorly worked in delimitation area, but then Professor Patricia Galvao-Taylor, she's working on protection of persons and human rights, and there's a report which is released recently that could be a relevant detailed study of what, if you're interested in the subject, you could go and have a look at it. But so that's one study group that I can think of is working on it. The ILC's work may lead to a future international legal framework, but currently the study report in itself is not binding. I also remember that Maldives as a state had proposed amendment to the 1951 Refugee Convention a few years ago, wherein it had stated to include climate change, sea level rise, environmental related reasons within the 1951 Refugee Convention, but it wasn't successful. The amendment was not successful. And therefore, that also remained as an unsuccessful venture. If I'm talking about international NGOs who are working on legal protection of these people right now, I can't think of any, but I can think of cases that have taken place in the international judicial bodies or quasi-judicial bodies. There was recently a case in Germany wherein an Afghanistani national was given refugee status because the court thought he was facing human rights challenges within Afghanistan arising due to environmental and climate change issues. So that was one thing. Then there was another case with the Human Rights Committee in 2019. The name of the case is Toyota versus the New Zealand. And in that, Toyota had approached Human Rights Committee to be declared as a climate change refugee under right to life, Article 6 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are a lot of legal, technical aspects of this case which I'm not delving into, but the committee said that Toyota and his family were not climate change refugees because there was no evidence to support that they were fleeing their country of origin because of climate change. So there are certain legal developments in this area, but nothing concrete right now. So fundamentally, it boils down to what the states are doing within their own jurisdictions. Now, if I take the example of India, the Indian refugee domestic laws are not one of the best practiced laws if we compare it with other countries that may or may not have refugee laws. Because if we're talking about broader refugee protection regime, India is still lacking on the basic refugee regime. We do not even have a generic refugee legislation in India right now. And so looking at having a climate change specific refugee law would be a distant dream to think about. But India is also one of those countries which is currently facing climate refugee crisis as we talk about it, because and I'm sitting here in Kolkata, and we're just like at the center of where the sea level rise is happening.
Exactly.
Lohichara Island, which is like a few miles away from here, Sagar Island, which is a few miles away from here. So Lohachara Island is the first island to be officially recorded to be submerged because of sea level rise in the 20th, 21st century. And the next in line is Sagar Island. So people from Lohachara Island, they were shifted to Sagar Island, and now Sagar Island is also submerging. And now I don't know where the people of Sagar Island would go, but I'm hoping they would be shifted to more mainland. And nobody is talking about it. And a lot of migrants from Bangladesh are also presumed to be migrating because of climate change and sea level rise crisis that is there in Bangladesh. And I don't know right now, I can't say concretely whether it's in favor of India to recognize the migrants of Bangladesh as climate change migrants or not. Will it benefit, will it help India to avail certain international remedies that otherwise be available to countries who are allowing climate change refugees or climate change displaced persons? I don't know yet, but it might be good to just look into potential climate change refugee related frameworks, at least in India. So taking a step backwards, why I gave India's example was because there are countries like India which do not have a fundamental basic refugee framework, and so we can't talk about climate change refugee framework as such within these countries. But then there are also countries like Sweden or US which in the past had made legislations to protect people who were fleeing climate change and other environmental factors. But now they are restricting their domestic regimes, looking at other country practices. So, and it is getting difficult by the day to think of domestic legislations, or for that matter, a broad global agreement on this specific issue.
If I may. So,
sure.
in such a scenario, when there are clashes not only between different governments, but also between private citizens and private players and the government of respective countries, where they both want different things, but in the interest of environmental concerns, do you think that international law could somehow be leveraged to find a midway or a middle ground where both parties could come to consensus, and there could be any foundational principles or something emanating out of the SDGs itself that could possibly help us find an amicable solution to a problem such as this?
My answer is both yes and no, and because if we leverage international law, if we can find ways to leverage international law, the challenge to it is again making sure that it is implemented in the right way. But then that can also be a challenge with domestic laws as well. So my answer would be both yes and no. We can leverage international law. We can leverage the SDG mechanism that we have. SDG is broadly about climate change. Climate change is one of the specific goals in SDG. Then justice for all is one of the goals in SDGs, and partnership and collaboration is one of the goals in SDGs. So if we combine all of these three together, we can think about a collaborative approach in the context of climate change to ensure that there is justice for the most vulnerable communities and that no one is left behind. And I think that should be the key to addressing climate change refugee issues, at least, because as the land is receding because of sea level rise, the chances of cross-border migrants or people who are forcibly displaced, the chances of them being forcibly displaced is only going to increase, and therefore the number of these people is only going to get increased. And with lack of land, we'll need more agreements or more reception from the other countries with more land to be able to integrate and accept people who are forced to migrate their countries of origin. So I think a collaborative approach could be very helpful.
I think building off of Akshat's question, on one hand you have the interaction between citizens and governments and companies within a country, but when we talk about, let's say, international agreements, an example of this would be the water contracts. There are many governments in South Asia and South America have signed with private water companies, and many of these agreements are in the form of BITs. So how can international environmental law help us to form and sign more equitable contracts, which in turn help the environment and the sharing of water and the like?
That's actually a difficult question and very broad one for that matter again. So if I'm saying equitable contracts, and if I'm raising the question of equitability in the context of BITs are more focused on business equitabilities, right? And so BITs are more about fairness to the business who actually made an investment. So equitability for corporations and profitability for corporations is different from benefits or equitability for the citizens. One way, although, I can think of that this could be balanced out in private contracts, which may or may not be BITs, is setting up of a fund, say as an insurance scheme for both the citizens who may be impacted because of the water contract, the local or the indigenous population, and at the same time, if at all the businesses are impacted because of change in regulations or so on and so forth. So that's one solution that I can think of, but again it'll depend on facts and circumstances of where the BIT is being signed or where the contract is being signed, who are the actors involved, etc.
Something just continuing on the conversation, maybe digressing a lot. So, in everything that is pertaining to international environmental law, one very broad criticism that comes up again and again, and for other international law disputes as well, is enforceability, right? So, what mechanism do you think that can be promulgated to look into enforceability, especially with regards to international environmental law? There has been a lot of talk about ecocide being implemented and being included into the Rome Statute, right, under Article 8. Would you think something of that sort would actually help minimize the loss and the risk that we're facing to our environment getting harmed again and again? Do you think that could be a equitable solution that's actually implementable and something that's doable in international law? And what difference do you think that will make?
All right, so again, your question has two parts. One is the enforceability of the treaties or the judicial pronouncements, and what, according to me, can be a solution to make sure they are enforceable in a more effective manner. Again, international law in general lacks on the aspect of enforceability because there's police power as such under international law, which we can say, okay, this particular organization is going to be responsible for enforceability. And I am theoretically at least always inclined to look at it from the behavior of states perspective, the behavior of states theory, where I can think of factors that the states may look at in order to enforce a treaty or a judicial pronouncement. And majorly, Professor Guzman would say there are majorly three factors that the state may be inclined, because of which the states may be inclined to enforce a particular treaty or a judicial pronouncement. Number one is the economic factor. So if the states think or believe that there's an economic benefit or developmental benefit for the citizens that may be coming for the states, they may be more inclined to enforce a particular treaty or a judicial pronouncement. And that is definitely the case with climate change negotiations, where the developing countries are continuously saying we would be in a better position to enforce our commitments related to climate change if we have more access to financial resources or technological resources. The second reason for this is, say, reputation. If the states are wanting to have a good reputation under international law, or within the international community, they may be inclined to again include some international policies within their domestic framework and enforce them. Examples of reputation would be, say, the indexes or the rankings under international law, the rankings on Human Development Index, the rankings on freedom of press, where the countries are generally ranked and listed, the rankings on the happiest countries in the world. So sorts like this could be, one of the ways to measure reputation and the criteria of reputation. And I think the third is other mutual benefits that the states would think in relation to international law. And other mutual benefits could include more mutual cooperation, benefits related to citizens, and that can come through a lot of exchange of information. Say, for example, during COVID-19, we saw there was no real-time legal agreement, but most countries followed similar lockdown procedures. And they did that because they saw benefit in doing so. So sometimes personal benefits for the state or mutual benefits for the states can also be the criteria for the enforceability factor. The second part of your question was related to ecocide. Do I think inclusion of ecocide as an international crime will help environmental cases around the world? My very pessimistic answer to this is no, because and my answer is based, of course, in two parallels that I draw. Parallel number one is that there are other international crimes as well, right? We have genocide, war crimes, crime of aggression, but even after their codification and definite enforcement against certain proven criminals of these crimes, has there been a deterrence at a global level, again, just generally against people who are not committing these crimes? The answer is no. The second parallel that I draw, because of my pessimistic negative answer, is based in the Indian situation itself. So, say, for example, when we had the Bhopal gas tragedy, we went against our own decisions, and we tried Warren Anderson, who was the head of UCC, the company responsible for Bhopal gas tragedy, and we tried to make sure that there were criminal responsibility imposed against the corporate actors, and we made sure that in one form or the other, ecocide was considered in India as a crime. Now, has that caused the corporations in India to prevent themselves from causing any disaster after the Bhopal gas tragedy? The answer is no.
Welcome back to the podcast. After discussing a lot of substantive questions in environmental law, The second part of the podcast, something that we want to focus on, is with regards to how a law student such as ourselves would probably find a way to IL, and more specifically to environmental law. So the next part of the podcast will be around that particular area, about ma'am's professional life, about how to just go about maybe getting an internship at a UN body, how much value does something like that add. So yeah, let's just take it off. Rudra?
Perfect. Chhaya, we realized that you've done a number of fellowships, and I'm sure that that helped you a lot when it came to not only actualizing what you had in mind professionally, but also bolstering your professional life to a massive degree. So, getting into environmental law, maybe getting into even refugee law as a profession, how does one go about that? And how do opportunities such as fellowships and internships, what role do they play in helping us get closer to that goal?
I think one of the ways, and I've heard it from a lot of people, is that sometimes some people get their calling. And I think my calling, I got it in environmental law, and I would give credit to a couple professors who helped me out during my law school, introduced to environmental law, and then working in that field specifically. Professor Shashikant Yadav was one of the professors who helped me through uh, getting into environmental law. And then I sort of started working in the field, and it grew on me, if I can put it that way. And then I kept on working in the field, and then I kept on getting opportunities and sort of grew in trajectory in this particular area. But for people who are specifically interested in public international law or international law in general or international environmental law, there are a variety of ways. So there's no straight jacket formula to how a person can get into these fields. A person can definitely pave their own pathways as to how they want to move forward in a particular area. Just for example, I know people who started in international law through moot court competitions and through writing, getting published in various fields of public international law, and then getting fellowships at the international judicial bodies like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, or for that matter, even the International Arbitration Institutes. And that could also be one of the areas under international law. And then they branched out through those fellowships. I know some people who worked in international courts of justice are now working or practicing specifically in areas of arbitration. Then I also know people who undertook masters and then went on with professorship or research position jobs, and then they found their way into law firms or international organizations that are practicing in their areas, in their field of areas. Then I also know people who pursued law and then they pursued masters. Then they specifically went into diplomacy or negotiations and positions that are more diplomacy oriented or negotiation oriented. And then there are people who are just researching in international law. And I think Akshat, when we were chatting off record, Akshat had mentioned how there's no um, court wherein we can just go enroll ourselves in public international law and start practicing. And yes, that stands true. It's a fact as we know it. And therefore, we should look at more academic ventures that can allow us to keep practicing international law. So, if you know, again, as a matter of fact, if we look at the judges of international courts, majority of them have emerged from the academic professorial system as we know it. Although they are political appointments, but most of them have been professors. Again, if you look at International Law Commission and people who are um, negotiating, drafting, and working in International Law Commission, most of them emerged from the academic professorial practice of public international law in general. So professorships or academic practicing could be one way of getting into public international law. And like I mentioned, fellowships could be other options, and then internships could be other options. Now, in internships could be very competitive as we talk about it. It is definitely not easy, and it's getting difficult by the day to get an internship in an international organization. However, I think it comes down to the specific requirements of a specific call for internship. So, say for example, if there's a call for an internship with a specific environmental or a UN unit, say for example, if it's the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, that has a call or a position for internship, then you would end up looking at the specific call, look at the competencies that they require, look at the area of work that they are looking to work in, and then assess whether you as an applicant can be a good fit given the competencies and the responsibilities that are there in that call. And then based on your cover letter and your resume, and sometimes there's also an additional written assessment plus interview. Based on all of this uh, process, one can land up with internships in these organizations. My tip generally to law students who are interested in the area would be to network with people who are working in this specific field, because networking can lead you to specific opportunities that are open in the field of public international law, and specific networking can also lead you to know more about what is the practical uh, issues that are being uh, dealt with as as a topical issue. So that could be relevant in terms of getting a profession in international law or environmental law, international environmental law. Yes.
Right. So, you've given us a lot of information about how to go with these internships, and especially on an international stage, getting these internships is a lot different, as compared to, applying for an internship at a national organization. For our listeners that might not have an idea as to how to go about a fellowship, could you explain to us how is a fellowship one different from an internship? What does it entail? And you've applied for a number of fellowships. You've been a fellow in a number of organizations. If you could maybe give us one example of how you went across with the application process and how that experience was.
Yes, so my recent fellowship was with the Refugee Law Initiative, University of London, and again it was similar competitive process as it would be applying for an internship or a job. Again, the key is to read the call for the fellowship, because the calls for fellowships or internships are very specific. They have specific requirements, specific criterias. They're looking for very specific, uh, substantial technicalities, and therefore you should prepare an application that fits into those competencies or technicalities that the call is looking for. So when I applied for the summer fellowship, I looked at the call and I thought my area of work, which is at the intersection of migration and climate change, fits well within the requirements of Refugee Law Initiative, and therefore I prepared an application, and I went through the process of application, interview, and then I was selected. And then again, each fellowship differs in the end product that you have to deliver. Some fellowships may require you, like my summer fellowship with the Refugee Law Initiative,
Yes.
required me to submit a research uh, piece with them, a research paper. And therefore, at the end of the fellowship, I submitted to them a research piece which was at the intersection of migration and climate change, specifically in the context of India. So that was the product that I had to submit in order to successfully complete the fellowship. Other fellowships may require you to engage in other activities. Say, for example, my fellowship with the United Nations Sustainable Development Network was more action oriented. It required me to focus on building partnerships and taking climate actions at the ground level. So that was a different fellowship, and they also provided us with a lot of training. And so one of the components of completing the fellowship successfully was to attend the training programs and successfully complete the modules. And so, again, each fellowship differs in its call for applications, who are the people they are looking for, how many months the fellowship would be for, what are the benefits you will receive out of that fellowship. It could be training, education, stipend, a position, funding. So these are the variety of benefits that one can receive through the fellowship. And then again, the end goal or the learning outcome of the fellowship or the end product of the fellowship can also differ based on the, how the fellowship is tailored and which organization is the fellowship related to. So yes.
Right. Another question is something that we were speaking about off camera, off record, was with regards to how LLM applications or just higher education beyond your the foundational law degree would get to you, right? So could you give us some glimpse about your experience at Vermont studying international law and how an international law LLM really could like help bolster your career and catapult it into practicing IL, if you could shed some light on that.
Yes. Again, there's no straight jacket formula to whether do you really want to do an LLM, where do you want to do your LLM from, what will be the pathway during the LLM, before the LLM, and after the LLM. Those are very personal, specific person specific questions, and that could vary as you speak to people differently. My LLM, when I did it from Vermont Law School, I thought I was prepared to undertake a master's degree specifically in environmental law, and therefore I moved forward with it. And it was definitely, you know, I would say a lifetime opportunity in the sense of the exposure that I got from studying LLM during that specific time at Vermont Law School because of the professors that I had, because of the courses that I took. And it has led me to also develop a network of like-minded people, like-minded individuals who are working in this field of environmental law and international environmental law. Now, again, this pathway could vary for a variety of people. I know people who practiced litigation and then did a master's after 5 years of litigation, but they did a very niche master's, say in arbitration or in corporate laws from a very specific university that they had targeted. So this could vary depending upon the needs of person, and it varies from person to person and the goals, specific goals of a person. If somebody is interested in public international law, I think they could do both. They could finish their law school and jump right into an LLM which specializes in public international law or international environmental law, and then start practicing it academically or practically as they deem fit after their LLM. But at the same time, they can also take their time, try their hand at litigation first, and take up issues which may be at the intersection of international law but relevant to India. They could also practice arbitration and then end up taking a more niche LLM in a specific area. But I think I can say one thing for sure, that the exposure that an LLM program abroad can give to an individual can be life altering in many ways. So, because just living abroad for a year and learning from, say, the best in the industry and the best in the academics in a specific field can be invigorating, but at the same time challenging, and therefore can be life altering. Yes.
Yes, I think when you talk about pursuing an LLM, which is a phenomenal feat, but also a very huge commitment on part of the student. So I think there's a lot of youngsters who listen to this podcast. A question that they, me as well, would have is, what is the scope of environmental law? What's the scope of migration laws in the coming years? And we understand the globe as a whole is at a turning point when it comes to environmental law, where you have a number of countries that are calling out the problems of climate change and understanding the implications. So what are the different avenues that you think are going to open up in the coming years, and how can students really capitalize on the same?
All right. I would begin with the emerging climate change litigations across the world. So there is this whole area of climate change litigation specifically against corporations, and so both corporate lawyers and environmental lawyers are contributing to climate change litigation just in general, globally. So that's a growing area of litigation. But at the same time, as lawyers or law students can also consider to becoming policymakers or negotiators at international climate change negotiations, or people who are supporting the governments in taking climate action, developing guidelines or policies. So there's a huge area of work which is at the intersection of environmental laws and migration, yes, environmental laws and corporate laws, environmental laws and security laws, which is an emerging area of environmental law. Then we have climate change, human rights, we have environmental law and climate change and law of the sea. So a whole area of diverse regimes which are at the intersection of environment and climate change are growing, and there would only be growing opportunities in the field of environmental law and climate change. Yes.
Perfect. I think that was a very succinct answer.
Okay.
And I think that brings us to the end of
Yeah.
our podcast.
Thank you so much for being here. You've definitely provided us a lot of input with not only the relevant topics and subject area, but also help students hopefully understand how to go about things, how to go about possibly pursuing a career or even just looking into international law. Thank you so much. Any final words? And then we
Exactly.
can
From
conclude.
your end to all our listeners.
Uh,
Sorry for putting you on the spot like that.
yes, that's a question I wasn't expecting, but final words would be take care, be safe, and yeah, I mean climate change is real. It's happening right now. That's it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chhaya Bharadwaj. And this is the end of the second episode. Stay tuned for the next episodes to come.
Thank you so much. We clap again. Oh fuck, I forgot.